Ever think about how close we've come to complete annihilation? I mean, like the whole world vanishing in a flash. That's the kind of chilling reality that loomed over the Cold War, a period that gripped the world in a silent terror from 1945 to 1991. Now, it wasn't your typical bang-bang, tanks rolling kind of war. It was more like a deadly staring contest, a high-stakes poker game between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each armed with enough nukes to turn the planet into dust. At the heart of it all, a clash of ideas, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism, playing out on a global stage. You're watching History Deciphered with Nathan Gale. Now let's get started. Alright, so, picture this. World War II is finally over. The good guys won, right? Nazis defeated, peace restored. Well, not quite. See, beneath the surface of victory, a new tension was brewing, like a pot simmering on the stove, about to boil over. The US and the Soviet Union, wartime allies, were starting to eye each other suspiciously. It's like that moment after a group project where you realize you and your partner have totally different ideas about what a good grade looks like. The biggest disagreement: the future of Europe. The US wanted to rebuild democracies, promote free markets, basically spread their version of the world. The Soviets, on the other hand, wanted to establish a buffer zone of communist states in Eastern Europe, a kind of safety net against future invasions. They'd been invaded twice in 30 years and decided enough was enough. This difference of opinion came to a head at the Yalta Conference in 1945. Leaders from the US, UK, and USSR met to hash out the post-war world order. But, let's be real, it was mostly Stalin calling the shots in Eastern Europe. He agreed, sort of, to free elections, but spoiler alert, those promises kind of evaporated. Then came two pivotal moments that really solidified the Cold War's icy grip. First, President Truman, a no-nonsense kind of guy, drew a line in the sand. He refused to recognize the communist government Stalin was setting up in Eastern Europe and implemented the Truman Doctrine, promising aid to countries resisting communism. It was like saying, okay, Stalin, that's far enough. And then, Winston Churchill, in his famous Iron Curtain speech, laid it all bare, describing the growing Soviet influence as an iron curtain descending across Europe. Chilling stuff. So, yeah, the honeymoon was officially over. The uneasy alliance crumbled, and the world held its breath as the Cold War began its deep freeze. Okay, so the stage is set, distrust is simmering, the Iron Curtain is drawn. What happens next? Well, things get eventful. Let's dive into some of the key moments that define this era, the moments that kept the world on the edge of its seat for decades. First up, the Berlin Blockade. 1948. Berlin, smack dab in the middle of Soviet-controlled East Germany, was divided into four sectors, with the Western Allies controlling West Berlin. Stalin, in a power move, decided to cut off all access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Allies out. He figured, starve them out, they'll give up. But the Allies, they weren't backing down. They launched the Berlin Airlift, an absolutely insane logistical feat. For almost a year, they flew in supplies, food, fuel, everything, around the clock, keeping West Berlin alive. Imagine, planes landing every few minutes, day and night, a constant lifeline against Soviet pressure. It was a staring contest with the highest stakes. Then, just a couple of years later, boom, the Korean War, 1950. Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviets, invades South Korea, backed by the US. This wasn't just a regional conflict, it was a proxy war, a battleground for the Cold War's bigger ideological struggle. It was brutal, bloody, and ended in a stalemate, but it showed just how far each side was willing to go. Fast forward to 1962, and things get really hairy. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets start placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, a mere 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Seriously, talk about a backyard threat. This was the closest the world has ever come to full-blown nuclear war. For 13 agonizing days, the world held its breath as Kennedy and Khrushchev stared each other down, the threat of annihilation hanging heavy in the air. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed. Diplomacy and some back-channel negotiations won the day, and disaster was averted. But the tension didn't just disappear. The Vietnam War, another proxy war, dragged on for years, further fueling the Cold War fire. And the whole time, both sides were engaged in a terrifying arms race, building up their nuclear arsenals to unimaginable levels. It was the logic of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, as it was aptly called. If one side launched, the other would retaliate, resulting in, well, the end of everything. And let's not forget the espionage. Spies, secrets, double agents. The Cold War was a breeding ground for intrigue. The CIA and the KGB were locked in a shadowy battle, each trying to outmaneuver the other. Think James Bond, but with even higher stakes. Oh, and one more thing. The space race. This wasn't just about who could get to the moon first. It was a symbol of technological superiority, a demonstration of who had the better system. When Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, went up, it sent shockwaves through the US. They'd been beaten, and it spurred them on to pour resources into their own space program. It was a race to the stars, with the fate of the world, in a way, hanging in the balance. So, we've talked about the big events, the standoffs, the close calls, but the Cold War wasn't just about missiles and spies. It had a profound impact on, well, pretty much everything. Geopolitically, the world was split. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949, became the backbone of the Western Alliance, a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The Soviets responded with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, their own military alliance, solidifying the division of Europe and the world into two armed camps. It's more like pick a side, and the lines were drawn. Economically, the Cold War spurred a different kind of competition. The US, through the Marshall Plan, pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe, not just out of the goodness of their hearts, but as a way to prevent the spread of communism. The idea was, a prosperous Europe would be less susceptible to communist influence. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union supported communist regimes, creating a divided global economy, each bloc vying for influence. And then there's the cultural impact. This one is kind of surprising, but the Cold War seeped into everything. Movies, music, art, even fashion. Think about it. Movies like Dr. Strangelove, with its darkly comedic take on nuclear annihilation, reflected the anxieties of the time. Music became a battleground of ideologies, with rock and roll seen as a symbol of Western freedom versus the more controlled cultural landscape of the Eastern Bloc. It was a battle for hearts and minds, fought not just with weapons, but with culture. Seriously, the Cold War was playing out on your radio and in your movie theaters. The long-term effects, well, we're still living with them. The end of the Cold War marked the triumph of liberal democracy and capitalism, but it also left a legacy of nuclear proliferation. Thousands of nuclear weapons still exist today, a chilling reminder of the destructive potential that defined the era. And the tensions, they didn't just magically vanish. We still see the echoes of the Cold War in the relationship between the US and Russia, the ongoing conflicts in different parts of the world, the shadow of nuclear threat that still hangs over us. It's a complicated legacy, one that continues to shape our world today. Okay, so after all that, you might be thinking, why do I need to know about this old stuff? And it's a valid question. But here's the thing, understanding the Cold War is like having a key to unlock so much of what's happening in the world today. It's really that important. First, it's essential for understanding modern history. I mean, the Cold War shaped the second half of the 20th century. It influenced everything: political alliances, economic systems, even cultural trends. The world we live in today is a direct result of the choices made, the conflicts fought, the tensions that simmered during those decades. If you want to get why things are the way they are, you got to understand the Cold War. Second, the Cold War offers some seriously valuable lessons for today's world. It's like a masterclass in international relations, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked military buildup, and a testament to the importance of, actually talking to each other. Diplomacy, negotiation, finding common ground. These aren't just buzzwords, they're the things that prevented the Cold War from turning hot. Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was seriously close. It shows us how close we can get to the brink and how crucial diplomacy is in pulling us back. And finally, studying the Cold War helps us appreciate peace. I know it sounds kind of obvious, but it's easy to take peace for granted. When you look back at how close we came to nuclear war, it really makes you appreciate the efforts that went into avoiding it. The leaders who chose dialogue over destruction, the moments where cooler heads prevailed. It's absolutely a reminder of how fragile peace can be. The Cold War isn't just some dusty old history book chapter. It's relevant to what's happening right now. It helps us understand the legacy of nuclear weapons, the complexities of US-Russia relations, even the impact of ideological struggles on global politics. It's a lens through which we can view current events, a framework for understanding the world around us. So, let's recap. The Cold War. It was this decades-long, nail-biting standoff between the US and the Soviet Union, a clash of ideologies that shaped the world. No direct fighting, but, let's be real, it was anything but peaceful. Proxy wars, espionage, a nuclear arms race that could have ended it all. It was intense. The Cold War's legacy, still with us today. It's in the alliances we see, the tensions that flare up, the very way we think about global politics. And honestly, studying it gives us perspective, a chilling reminder of what could have been and the importance of working towards a more peaceful future. What do you think? What's the biggest takeaway you got from the Cold War? Let me know in the comments. I'm seriously curious to hear your thoughts. And if you want to dive deeper into this fascinating, often terrifying period, hit that subscribe button for more videos on the Cold War. We'll be exploring key events, pivotal figures, and the surprising cultural impact of this era. Until next time, keep exploring history.